The other side of data as well is that it's useless if it's not used. So it's also how do we build, I guess, firstly, like data literacy, particularly within governments. As a ex-civil servant myself, data literacy is not something that was often front of mind. Like it would be something siloed away to economists or statisticians or IT teams, but it needs to be a fundamental tool of policymaking, service design, service delivery. So part of like you're building data workflows, you're building skills, and you're also trying to make data useful for decision making. So that includes how you're telling stories around data, how you're doing visualization, dashboards, and all this as well. So I agree, like data and all these other tools are really valuable in terms of actually trying to get us back on track.
Hi, Smart Community friends, and welcome back to the Smart Community Podcast. In this episode, I have a fantastic conversation with Calum Handforth. Calum works for the United Nations Development Programme, the UNDP, and has led innovation and digitisation efforts globally, as well as advised governments around the world. He was also co-chair of the Digital Infrastructure Taskforce, part of the World Economic Forum G20 Working Group on Smart Cities. In this episode, Calum and I discuss the types of things he works on at the UNDP and the progress made on the 17 Sustainable Development Goals since they were introduced in 2015. We talk about using data and storytelling to drive progress and innovation, including Calum's BLT acronym when thinking about data and the potential of open source digital solutions to improve city infrastructure and services. Calum tells us about his favourite project he's been working on at the UNDP that incorporated a human-centred design approach to improve a market in Gambia, and the emerging trends of refocusing on the city as the centre of innovation and development. We finish our chat discussing the importance of community and of sharing failures to achieve the SDGs and smart community outcomes, plus the power of celebrating even small wins. As always, we hope you enjoy listening to this episode as much as we enjoyed making it.
Welcome to the smart community, smart regions, smart towns, and smart cities. It's where we live, work, and play. With smart communities, the future starts today. Big data, smart mobility, emerging trends galore. The Smart Community Podcast is what you're looking for.
Hi again, Zoe here, just popping in on a personal note. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to make it to Barcelona this year as I had a family situation and I wasn't able to go overseas at that moment. So I really missed everyone. I got lots of different photos and updates. So thank you for all of you who sent me updates who were over there. I really look forward to attending again next year, hopefully. So yeah, I just thought I'd let you know that because I know that I mentioned it quite a number of times. I was very excited, but unfortunately I was not able to make it. Okay, enjoy this episode. Bye. Hello, Calum. How are you today?
Hi, good morning, Zoe. I'm good. Thank you.
That is awesome to hear. I am really excited to have you on the podcast on this beautiful Friday morning. So let's just jump straight in. And can you tell us your background and what you're passionate about?
Thanks. Thanks again for having me. So in terms of background, I work at the United Nations Development Programme, leading and shaping a lot of our work on digitalisation, innovation, and also smart cities. In terms of what I'm passionate about, I think it's about how we can put those tools, so digital technology and innovation, use them for social good and for real social impact as well.
Awesome. I mean, that's a huge remit.
It's a little, yeah, exactly. Very, very exciting and a real privilege.
That's amazing. And just before when we were talking, you were saying you worked in cities before. Can you give us a little bit of your professional background, how you ended up in this space?
Yeah, so before joining the UNDP, spent a lot of time working in the development sector, working quite closely with national and local governments, many parts of the world. And then many, many years ago, I was back in the UK, back in London, where I was working in national government and also local government. So managing digital infrastructure, policies, other aspects in city level and also at national level too.
Awesome. And you're based in Singapore now, is that right?
Based in Singapore now. So my role is split between our Chief Digital Office team in New York and our UNDP Global Centre for Technology, Innovation and Sustainable Development, which is a collaboration between the Government of Singapore and UNDP here in Singapore.
Awesome. Well, I'm looking forward to getting into some of the work you do in a bit more detail. But let's go broad first. And can you tell me what a smart community means to you?
So I really like the smart community framing. Often when we hear the kind of term smart cities, right? If you Google smart cities, you see page after page of high-tech cities, laser beams all over the place, but often no people, no trees, no livelihoods, no animals. So I think this community aspect is really interesting, because for me, the drive of any kind of city and smart city or any type of innovation is people, your kind of human capital. So I think for me, a smart community is a community that is empowered to engage with these kind of tools, but it's also a community that is shaping decisions and shaping how cities are evolving and developing.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting because, when I first came into this space, there were so many laser beams, and I'm like, why do we need so many laser beams?
Yeah, exactly.
Like people often would say, it's like the Jetsons, like smart cities like the Jetsons. And I would often say, I think it's a combination of the Flintstones and the Jetsons, where we're actually, using our human resources more effectively, what makes sense, and also learning from the stuff that still works, and then using the tools available. So yeah, I think the people aspect, and even just like, it seems like a small thing when we talk about visualization of, a smart city or a smart community, or like, what people are actually seeing. But actually, if you continue to show those kind of, images without any people, then you can't, like, it doesn't work, right?
You're completely right. And you mentioned the word tool, right? For me, this is about how we, give cities a kind of broadest possible toolkit. I think the risk is that, so cities are a really key driver of development, right? We're going to see by, the middle point of this century, like 2.5 billion more people living in cities, particularly a lot of urbanization growth across Africa and Asia. It's really phenomenal. So we really need to understand, how we position cities as really key drivers of sustainable development. And as part of that is about recognizing that there are different modalities to the city. And I think that toolkit is really important. So when we talk, for example, about smart cities, we talk about technology and innovation. And even that slightly broader framing means you can then look at the high tech, you can look at the low tech, the kind of frugal innovation, that kind of Flintstones example, how you reuse what's gone before, the kind of more basic stuff. But then it also includes things like nature-based solutions, like, how do we start looking at the urban environment more holistically, and how we can use different resources, different framings, different pathways to kind of actually make cities, livable, inclusive, sustainable, and so on.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And I think from a UN level, it's obviously like that kind of really high level and strategic, but then breaking it down to make it really practical as well, because it's not just about the thinking anymore. It's actually about the action and what we're actually going to do about this as well, right?
Exactly. So we're very fortunate at UNDP. So we have about 170 country offices around the world. So we go quite quickly from that kind of global piece down to working very closely with our country offices on the ground, many of whom are working with every city. So from capital cities to tier 2, tier 3, smaller cities, and obviously also the kind of last mile. And I think when we look at this kind of smarter city or smart community angle, you're also looking beyond the geographical bounds of the city. Like, you're looking at the impact of the city on kind of rural areas, the rural urban migration aspect. You're looking at the city in the context of other cities in the country or in the region too. So I think that broader framing is really helpful. And I think very lucky to be at UNDP, where we have like global and strategic work that we do, but we also very quickly are trying to make this stuff and making it relevant on the ground with our country offices as well.
Yeah. I think I'm keen to discuss some of the projects and things you've been working on, but let's start with a bit of framing, I guess, for the audience when, thinking about UNDP. What's a day in a life look like for you, and what types of things are you doing?
So a day can be quite a long day. The exciting thing about my role is it's global, but the harder thing about my role is it's also global. So, we're doing a lot of work across Asia Pacific here in the region, a lot of work across the African continent, Central Asia, Eastern Europe, and also Latin America as well. Like, urbanization is a really exciting opportunity globally, but there's also real challenges and issues it can pose as well if not managed well. So there's no shortage of demand for collaboration and for support and guidance in that context. I think in terms of a typical day, a lot of our time is spent working with our country officers. They're the ones on the ground doing this really, really important work and engagement. And it's how, as a global function, we can support and amplify that work. So it might be technical advice, it might be policy advice, it might be bringing new partnerships and new solutions into countries and into cities. Sometimes it's about training, and also it's about giving cities platforms to share this stuff as well. So we have obviously big global events like the UNDP works on, like the UN General Assembly, just a few weeks back. But then also, how do we start building dialogues between cities around the world on a more regular basis to share that kind of learning you mentioned earlier, and to kind of learn from each other as well.
Yeah, awesome. And I guess from a project perspective, you've got your country offices. What types of things? I mean, you've explained a little bit, but is it really? I mean, I guess it would be very varied, right, on the types of things you're doing. So, and your remit is around smart cities, and you also deal with a lot of like AI and things like, kind of obviously it fits into that space. But what types of, I guess, different projects and things are you working on in this space?
Yeah. So I should have mentioned earlier with the kind of framing, but within the UN system, UNDP is a steward of all 17 Sustainable Development Goals. So these were the 17 goals agreed by the General Assembly in 2015 with a deadline of 2030, tackling areas, like ending poverty, improving gender equality, improving conservation and biodiversity management. There's a real focus of many, many different areas. Often I think we focus on, particularly when we talk about cities, we focus on SDG number 11 about sustainable and broader communities and cities. But I think if we look at this kind of broader framing of smart cities, cities are relevant for every single one of the SDGs. And that then translates into the work that our country offices are doing. So, for example, we have our team in Cuba, for example, doing some great work on like urban mobility, like how do they do multimodal transport that is wanted and demanded by the community in a much more holistic way. So that's, going to be talking quite discreetly to SDG 11, but also they're bringing in new voices into that perspective. So there's a lot of work around equality there too. We've got our team in the Gambia, for example, who are improving like local revenue tax collection to improve municipal service management and delivery. So again, there you're looking at partnerships with local communities, you're looking at leveraging technology and so on. But I think back to your point on technology, I think we always see the technology as a tool. So we do get cities and countries come to us and say, look, we would like to do some work on AI or blockchain or big data. Our first aspect is trying to understand, what is the drive of this technology? Because we don't want to be led by the solution. We need to found this stuff on the problem and the need and the requirements locally. Sometimes AI can be a valuable tool for this, or big data or 5G. Sometimes we may need a different tool. Sometimes we may not need a tool at all. It's more of a governance process or a dialogue or a culture shift or something.
Yeah, absolutely. I think to actually solve a problem, you need a tool, not the other way around, right? So actually defining that problem first is really important.
Exactly.
Been doing a lot of work in this space as well. So that's so refreshing to hear that you're obviously taking that similar approach where it's not, tell me how to install IoT. It's actually, well, what do you want to do with that? And what problem are you trying to solve? Because maybe it's not that. And sometimes it may be just, actually that team just needs to talk to that team because that data is already available, or whatever the case is, right?
That's exactly it. And all of our teams, because we have that really fortunate global footprint there on the ground, working with communities. So elements like human-centered design, co-design, building these kind of feedback loops, it's front and center of our work, because if not, we don't know what tools we need to be bringing into the problem to tackle the problem either.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, just going back a little bit, just in case people don't know what the Sustainable Development Goals are, I assume most people listening will, but maybe, and you've given a little bit of an explanation, can you just give us a bit of a 101? And then also when the work started and what kind of progress you've seen to date? Yeah,
so thanks for the prompt, because we talk about this language sometimes and there's definitely a bit of an assumption around it. So the Sustainable Development Goals were agreed at the UN General Assembly by all member states in 2015. And they are a set of 17 goals to improve, how we live on the planet, tackle poverty, improve coexistence with nature, build partnerships, obviously improve peace and many other aspects as well. We have 17 of these goals. They're enormous in scope. Like we're looking at, ending poverty, improving biodiversity on land, in the sea, driving new industry and opportunity. And obviously most recently in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, real focus on good health and well-being as well. I think what's interesting about the SDGs is two aspects that really come to mind for me. First is that they're all interlinked. So obviously we can't tackle poverty if we're not also improving gender equality, or if we're not creating new industries and new opportunities. The second is that all 17 SDGs are relevant for every single country around the world. It's not just a lower income context. So the precursor to the SDGs was the Millennium Development Goals, which ran until 2015. These were largely focusing on lower income countries. The SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, are a truly global task and priority. The slightly, well, not slightly, but the much more distressing fact now is that, particularly after the context of the pandemic, that we're off track with, I think, many of the SDGs. We have a deadline of these of 2030, and in some cases, we're seeing progress halting, and even in some cases, we're seeing progress reversing or going into decline. UNDP, we measure what we call human development in countries around the world. And actually, in 2020, firstly, we saw the first global increase in global poverty for the first time in 2 decades. But then we also saw human development reversals in about 90% of countries around the world. So this stuff is getting very, very scary. And there's a real need to kind of get us back on track to achieving these by 2030.
Yeah, that's a lot. Thanks for sharing that. Because I also think even if we're working or we're in the space, might be aware of the SDGs, actually, you've got your 17 up top, but there's so many different layers underneath, right, of actual, exactly. The actions that happen. It's not just this kind of top level. It's all these other things that you're measuring against.
That's exactly it. And we've got, I think, more than 300 targets for the SDGs, which are ways to, kind of guide your action on the ground. And actually, we published a study last month at the General Assembly where we saw that actually technology and digital actually directly contribute to about 70% of those goals, and probably are also, quite significant contributors to the other 30% as well. So there's a element about the tool conversation, like, how do we actually drive resource and direction against those? But also elements like, this discussion here, like, are really important because we need to be building that kind of community and momentum and partnership to achieve this stuff as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just starting those conversations and that, awareness leads to focus, which then leads to action, I think is really important. And I think, like everything, the SDGs were kind of a really hot topic, maybe 4 years ago or so. But now it's like, well, now the actual action's happening. It's the hype of, the hype curve, right? We all kind of think about that. And now it's like, well, those actions, and particularly ones where we're seeing things go backwards as well, I guess, can we use tech and data to help us kind of reverse that?
Yeah, the data one is a really interesting one. So I'm a pretty big data nerd. So same. I think when we talk about smart cities, when we talk about smart cities, often like it becomes synonymous with big data. And big data can be really powerful and really useful in terms of, showing trends at enormous levels and allowing us to course correct. I have this really cheesy acronym about like data being like BLT. So big data is one, but we also need to use lean data and thick data. So lean data is like data you can use to like, iterate your product or service if you're, an innovator working in the urban space. Lean data is also useful if you're managing like a portfolio of different interventions. So if you're a city administrator or policymaker. But the thick data is the kind of more qualitative insights, the time in communities, I guess the lives and the livelihoods behind those big data points. So I think when we talk about data, it's also building that kind of broad understanding of what data is and how it can be useful, because these different aspects of data can drive different elements of progress. Like big data can give you the kind of trends and the direction and allow you to really pivot. Thick data gives you that underlying need of the community that you can then design tools and responses and interventions around. But the other side of data as well is that it's useful if it's useless if it's not used. So it's also, how do we build, I guess, firstly, like data literacy, particularly within governments. As a, ex-civil servant myself, data literacy is not something that was often front of mind. Like it would be something siloed away to economists or statisticians or IT teams, but it needs to be a fundamental tool of policymaking, service design, service delivery. So part of like, you're building data workflows, you're building skills, and you're also trying to make data useful for decision making. So that includes how you're telling stories around data, how you're doing visualization, dashboards, and all this as well. So I agree, like data and all these other tools are really valuable in terms of actually trying to get us back on track.
And I think the storytelling element is really key. And I've been doing a lot of thinking around that as well, and reading, or I say reading, listening, because I always listen to audiobooks, but listening to audiobooks around it as well. I just listened to Data Feminism, which I found really fascinating, because it actually, so when I was doing my Master of Data Science, it was a lot about taking the emotion out of it, right? Whereas this is like the complete opposite of that, of recognizing that as human beings, no matter what you take out of the data, what you show, you're adding emotion because you're an emotional, person and a human being. So you're going to add whatever is already happening. So actually we can use that in our storytelling, which again can be used for good or evil, but we already know that it's used on the other side as well when we think about marketing and all that kind of stuff as well. Can we actually use that in a positive way, in a good way, to actually get action happening or elicit a certain emotion based on real numbers and facts, and also the thick data that you're talking about as well is so important, because the numbers and the stories have to be included, because if they're not, we're just, there's so many different implications depending on what it is. It's too many to actually to name, but things like bias and things like that, because if we don't understand the stories, what's the point? Like, we're not doing this for humans, then what are we actually doing, right?
I couldn't agree more. And you mentioned the bias and the gender angle, I think, are really important when we talk about data. So there's a really good study done by our friends at UNICEF, I think, during the pandemic, where they looked at the kind of impact of movement restrictions on people's behavior. And they saw in some countries, the movement, because they could you look at, movement of mobile phone data and this kind of stuff, they could see that actually, maybe a movement restriction was about, 80, 90% effective in a country. But when they disaggregated that by poverty level or income level, they saw that actually the poorest people in that community were the ones who were moving around more during lockdown, because they had to go out to work. They couldn't work from home because their work was more informal or flexible, or required them to be obviously supporting other parts of the community. So I think first is that kind of importance of really digging into the data. But also when we talk about aspects like gender, it's also the source of that data. We see a lot of work happening where you're using mobile phone data to inform policies. And again, migration is a great one here. You can use, and we have seen use completely anonymized call data to see actually how people are moving around to tackle crisis. But often in many communities, women won't own a mobile phone. So you're risking designing policies and interventions that are only relevant or useful for half your population, because you're not counting that half of the population in the first instance. So it's also how we're getting this data and how we're making it useful, but also being alert to those biases as well. And then just finally on that, I talked earlier about dashboards. Dashboards are a really, really valuable tool, but often dashboards will only feature what is easy to measure or what you can even measure in the first place. And so sometimes we need to really be cautious about actually what we see on the screen is not the whole story. There's often a lot more stories and perspectives that we can't visualize, or we don't understand, or we don't collect in the first place, or we don't even know that are happening.
Yeah, that's so important. And I think, thanks for sharing the mobile phone example as well, because I think sometimes when we talk about the gender inequity and things like that, people often just go to the really kind of obvious things. Whereas, just thinking about who are you excluding just because they don't have, the phone or whatever. But you have to think about that when you're measuring these things, because sometimes it's not just that, a lot of the time it's not that blatant, obvious, bias and things like that really makes the impact. Those things exist as well, of course, but they're a bit more obvious these days because we're talking about them more. But it's that underlying the things that are missing is really key. One of the first books I read on it was Invisible Women, and I found that fascinating, and just kind of then leading on to then that, led me to more and more and getting deeper into it with the data side of things. And what I liked about data feminism was that it didn't just present, this is the issue. It actually then started talking about some of the things we could do to solve it, and the work that people all around the world are doing as well.
I agree, man. I mean, Invisible Women for me was a really powerful book where you see just how systematically data can, badly collected data or not telling the right story can have impact. So for those of you who haven't read it, it's everything from female police officers, their body armor doesn't work in the same way because they haven't used female models, to we've kept office temperatures too cold for women for 50 years because we've based temperature measurements in an office on male workers. So this work has systematic and really kind of negative multipliers if we don't do it well. And it's really concerning in that sense. The other part is how you bring, just staying with the gender angle as well, how you bring more voices into this space. So I think one of the really exciting areas we see about digital adoption is you need to be building local content and content that is relevant to people, because often we talk about digital and digital transformation, the internet, but in some places this stuff is quite abstract. It doesn't seem relevant to day-to-day lives. But if you make it relevant and tangible and real, that's how you drive inclusion to many extents. So if you're building content in local languages, if you're building content that speaks to different audiences, I used to do some work with girls' coding clubs. If you're getting girls building stuff, probably other girls are going to want to use those tools and products and services. And that's how you start driving inclusion in that aspect as well. It's not a panacea or a silver bullet, but it's one tool again in your toolkit to start making this work and this world much more inclusive.
Yeah, absolutely. I often talk about we need more diversity behind the code to serve the diversity in front of it. Because if we're using things that aren't designed by people that, that look very different to us and think very differently to us. And again, it's not a one size fits all, not as we know, it's not a homogenous group by any stretch of the imagination, women or, any kind of community, right? We're not a homogenous group. And so having more diversity is so important. And it's not just, like background and ethnicity and things like that. That's obviously really, really important as well. But also just bringing different creative, the word escapes me. I want to say creative tendencies, but just the way that our brain works, right? Like getting more people, the creative people into STEM, because, I need more engineers that actually care about the world. And, if you want to change the world, you want to be asking, what type of engineer should I be? I'm an engineer, so I'm biased in that element. So I want more people that really care about sustainability in there, that, that you don't just have to go down, you can bring all those skill sets with you. And I think that's really important when we get, like, we're not just, you don't just have to like concrete and maths to be an engineer or whatever the case is, because we can make a real difference in this space if we've got more scientists that have, that bring different thoughts and different ways of thinking in or different experiences from their worldviews as well.
I couldn't agree more. And we're seeing this with AI, right? Like, we need the computer science. Like, we need to understand, how these tools work, how they function, how they can be interrogated and audited and all this. But you also need the social science. Like, a lot of stuff we talk about AI, particularly around ethical applications and so on. These are not new conversations. These are grounded in decades, hundreds, centuries of years of knowledge, of ethics, of philosophy, sociology, and politics. And there is a need for these two elements to kind of coexist more. And I think a lot of our work at UNDP is driven by what we call collective intelligence. And that is exactly what you're speaking there, is that how do we broaden our innovation to include more new and also underheard voices? Like, it's to all of our benefits, because we end up building better things if we're working on this stuff together. One thing I'm particularly passionate about is also, we talk a lot about what we call South to South collaboration, how do lower income countries and cities work together and collaborate together. But for me, there's something really cool about South to North as well. So, for example, Kenya, Nairobi in particular, had, mobile money like 15 years before London did, because of that kind of need on the ground for innovation and other aspects. So how can, I don't like the term, but how do developed countries learn from their developing counterparts? Because there's so much opportunity to kind of learn from the innovation and the perspectives and the minds in many countries around the world.
Absolutely. And then that opens up the dialogue, so then we can share back and forth as well, right? Because we're both getting something out of that. It's not just one way. No, I totally agree. And even just learning from different cultures, just working, I've been like working and visiting around the world, the things just, again, we're both doing, I don't know, like the same outcome, but the way that we approach it is so different. We can learn from each other. We might not change anything, but you just kind of like get a better appreciation, or you just go, yeah, I wonder why we do it that way. And just asking, those kind of questions, if we could do it in a different way. And it also always fascinates me when we can actually agree globally on how to do something like or a certain technology, like barcodes, for example, like they're everywhere. Like, how amazing is that we did that on global scale? But we need to do that for other things. So, so we have interoperability with data and IoT and things like that as well. So then we can actually really collaborate across borders. And I mean, that can be like a global country level, but even just sometimes the same organization needs to have that, you start really small, but then we can kind of spread out. And I think we've been able to do it before in the past, like you said, with some of those other examples. But yeah, then it's branching out to these other more complex systems, which seems so overwhelming now as well.
Completely agree. And we actually have some work coming out, I think, later this year on the role of like open source within cities. You know this better than anyone as an engineer, but for others, like open source is, how you have, for example, with software, your code is completely visible, so people can reuse it, adapt it, adopt it, audit it. But we also have open source hardware, so things like 3D printing, maker spaces, and this kind of stuff. And open source is really valuable for that kind of interoperability, right? You can connect different solutions, you can build in-house, you can strengthen your kind of digital resilience. But it also shapes a really interesting way of thinking about collaboration and openness and agility and building that kind of ecosystem within your city or your community or your country. So we're really excited to kind of launch this. I think hopefully next month the paper will be out. But that kind of, on a technological level, the mindsets and the tech behind open source could be really powerful ways of actually driving some of those, city collaborations, global collaborations, that kind of partnership as well.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I've been doing a bit of work in that space too. It's a different way of thinking about things. Like it's quite the opposite of say a Western or this kind of capitalization world we find capitalist world we live in. So it is different. But it's so important, particularly when we're talking about that communication and with the communities, then they can understand that digital literacy that you were talking about earlier. I'm going to Barcelona. Actually, I'll have gone by the time this episode comes out at the Smart City World Expo. And I'm on a great panel with a lady from the CEO, Jacqueline from Helpful Places. And
I'm a big fan of Jackie. She does great work. Yeah, exactly.
Amazing. So like just one example, and I'll have to get her on the show. So then to the audience, we'll get Jackie on the show, but we'll put the link in the show notes. But she's basically the plan open source, global standard to
taxonomy of
I'm not explaining it very well, so the audience can be like, what is this? I don't understand. But basically being able to communicate to the community what technology is available. But it's like a QR code that you can scan, and then you can see the data behind it, you can see the technology that's being used. But what I love about it the most, and to be honest, I need to get into it in more detail, and I'm really excited to meet with Jackie, is that you have to, as the person deploying the technology, the questions that you have to answer, what are you using this data for, who's using it, they are so important because, and you have to answer them before you can kind of deploy that if, you follow the standards or whatever. So I think that's a really interesting piece, and it's really going to shift the way we think about how we communicate what technology we're deploying, because we've thought about it, which is really good as well.
Yeah, and then the other side is from the resident perspective in the city as well. The model, like you say, has this kind of taxonomy of, for example, you scan a QR code above a traffic camera, and it tells you, who's collecting that data, why they're collecting it, why it's useful for you. And I think you're also making this stuff more tangible and real to people, because they don't just see a sensor, just there. They actually see, okay, this has improved my day-to-day life by doing X, Y, and Z. So again, making this stuff more tangible and relevant can be really powerful. Just on our open source angle as well, like UNDP, we are one of the kind of big partners of what we call a Digital Public Goods Alliance, which is a kind of repository of open source digital solutions. And I think the other part of open source is that it means that cities and countries don't have to start their journey from scratch. Like it can start 70, 80% of the way down the path. There's no need to reinvent a wheel or build from new or even make the same mistakes as other places. The registry is really exciting because we've got hundreds of different innovations on there that anyone can use immediately. So anything from a fully fledged identity platform to a payment platform to smaller interoperability components, even things like, council websites are on there as well, kind of like a front end that you could, drop in your logo or your details, and then you have a website for your local authority. So if anyone is listening and is doing digital work on this, like go to the Digital Public Goods Registry, see if there's tools there. But also, if you're building open source solutions, let us know, because we'd love to find ways to recognize these for other cities, other communities to use around the world too.
That's awesome. We'll put all the links in the show notes so people can find that. That's awesome. I love that. I'll go check that out myself as well. Now, we are going to go to the future soon, but I firstly want to ask you, what is your favorite project that you have done or been involved in or are aware of?
There's no shortage of them. I'm phenomenally fortunate to be in this position, to be working with so many cities and innovators. One that I did especially enjoy was one last year with our team in the Gambia, in Banjul, the local authority there, where we were working again from scratch, a human-centered design approach, a co-design, to improve how the local market was functioning. So like how traders could better pay their rent for their space, but also how I could communicate with other traders, for how citizens could understand, where to go in the market to actually buy particular produce and all this. So it was a really exciting way of getting quite deep into a local issue where you're helping residents, you're helping traders, and then you're also helping the municipal authority in terms of tax collection, revenue collection, and all this as well. But yeah, I'm very lucky that every day we're working on really, really exciting and important stuff.
That's awesome. We'll put the links for your website and everything in the show notes as well. And yeah, I think people would be super interested because there's so much scope in this space as well. So you must work on a whole range of different things too. No one day would be the same as the next.
Yeah, I'm very lucky.
That's awesome. Okay, well, let's zoom to the future now. What do you think the emerging trends are that people aren't talking about enough?
So I think one of the big ones for me is that, cities are potentially not under-recognized, but they are a real driver of development. So I think the more we can engage at the city level, and as we talked about earlier, like redefine what the smart concept means, to look at that kind of broader toolkit, and that inclusion aspect is really essential. When we're looking at a world where the SDGs are off track and progress by 2030 is looking very, very difficult, we need to be looking particularly at cities because they're the closest administrative actor to people. It's where a lot of innovation is coming from. And they're also often real catalysts of national economies as well. So for me, the city piece is really interesting and really, really important. In terms of under-recognized, I think understanding the kind of online, offline, I guess, dichotomy is really important. Like we talk a lot about things like the gig economy, online e-commerce, this kind of element, but we don't think about what this means in the real world. Like, for example, how do we redesign our spaces to support, gig workers who are often working in quite precarious positions in their work? How do we look at redesigning offline spaces to support e-commerce? Because I'm sure we're all receiving many parcels at home and so on, and local services are stretched. So I think that online, offline piece is maybe a little bit underexplored. And then the third aspect for me is also that kind of redefinition of the smart city. Like, let's look at that kind of broader toolkit, and would love to hear from anyone in the audience. What are you working on that is obviously high tech, low tech, no tech as well, because we need this broadest possible toolkit for all the urban challenges and the opportunities that we're seeing.
Yeah, I think that's a really a nice frame of the kind of the recognition that it's not all online or offline, it's not all digital. It's like, as we know, but sometimes we might forget about that when we're only thinking about, the digital tools or whatever, but actually what is that interaction with the physical realm as well as the digital realm? Because the more we move into this digital realm, I also think we see this kind of move to digital, but then we see the comeback of the kind of physical realm as well. So we're always going to have that kind of push and pull, I think.
Exactly. And I think that it doesn't have to be a tension. I think there's a really exciting opportunity to have more of that kind of, that journey between the online and the offline and vice versa. And we'd love to see, cities engaging with that more. And it's everything from, how you redesign your public space for, I don't know, community parcel hubs or whatever, to how we look at the impact of things like the gig economy and things like dark kitchens and so on. There's a lot of stuff that I think is really worthy of digging into deep, and how we design or redesign public spaces for the 21st century.
So where to next for smart communities?
It's a very good question. I think for me, the community is the key aspect here. As we talked about in terms of open source, the SDGs, every city around the world is on this journey together. Maybe some are further ahead, some are a little bit further behind. Some have slightly different outcomes or destinations in mind. But we're all looking at, how do we make our urban spaces more inclusive, more livable, more sustainable, resilient and connected. So I think that community is really important, like learning from each other, talking to each other. I'm a big fan of sharing failures. As 3 fail startups to my name and this kind of stuff, like we should be sharing what isn't working as well, and being open and honest, because it's only through that sharing and that discussion and this kind of community that we're really going to get to achieving the SDGs and other outcomes as well. So for me, where it should go next is to keep that community and to really value that community as well.
Yeah, I think the values is a really important one. Again, it's easier said than done. I think it's a mindset shift, right? It's similar to the open source, I suppose, because we don't we're very scared of failure, and then, that kind of that societal pressure. And then on the opposite, when you hear someone fail, you actually need to shift your mindset as well, because you think about what can I learn from this, not just, oh my God, I can't believe they did that, or whatever the case is.
Well, you're completely right. And you also mentioned celebrate. So as a ex-public servant, like when you're in the civil service, you only get heard sometimes when things go wrong. And we also need to be celebrating talent. And actually on that note, last week we launched our annual Future of Government Awards, so futureofgovernmentawards.com. And what we want to do is we want nominations from truly everywhere about local cities, governments who are working on digital and innovation, because we want to champion civil servants and the teams. We have 2 awards on there actually that are explicitly about open source, people who are using open source solutions or adapting them. But we also have an award for teams, individuals, leaders as well, because we really need to champion this public sector talent, because it's where a lot of problems are being solved. And it's also where we need more minds and new perspectives into that world. And so if we can encourage people to think about that as a career because we're celebrating it, I think is really important.
I think that's so important because we need that talent we need that thinking, that different thinking in the government. And I think it's going, like I always see the smart community kind of approach and doing things differently and celebrating that as a really important one for talent attraction and retention. Because if we don't, we can't compete on that global scale. And there's only so much consultants can do without, that driver from the inside. So I think that's great. And we'll put the link in the show notes as well so people can find that too.
That's really kind. Thank you. And I think all of you working in digital and agile, it's very easy to run a sprint and go on to the next thing and the next thing and never pause and look up and reflect and celebrate. We've got a blog on this. I think if we can maybe add to the links as well, but it's mentions a thinker in a space called Whitney Johnson. And she has this notion of celebrating to win, that actually if we want to do bigger and better things, we have to celebrate what we've done already, because that celebration is a really powerful driver of doing bigger, better things as well. So celebration in itself is really important, but I'm sure all of you don't have celebrations in your KPIs or your project plans, but it's a really, really important aspect to do this stuff well. Yes.
Okay. So add celebration into the KPI. How many celebrations did we have? And maybe they're celebrations of failure as well, of learnings, what we learned.
Exactly. I think this is a really important direction, and we really want to see innovations around the world through the awards and champion that where we can as well.
Awesome. Well, Calum, it's been so great to have you on the podcast. I feel like we definitely could have some more conversations, and I think we definitely will, and we need to. Maybe we can find a place around the world and meet in 3D at some point too.
I hope so. Thank you for having me.
No, that was awesome. One last question. How can people connect with you?
So usual channels, LinkedIn, Twitter, or X. I'm on there. I'll share my email as well. I'm happy to keep in touch and always very happy to learn about what others around the world are doing. So please do keep in touch and look forward to hearing from you.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Calum, again for coming onto the podcast. And I really look forward to our next conversation.
So you're looking forward to it too. Thanks for having me.
Bye.
Bye.
The Smart Community podcast is brought to you by My Smart Community. If you're trying to deal with disruption, not sure what technologies to buy, need to facilitate genuine collaboration, then we can help. Email hello@mysmart.community or head to www.mysmart.community/consulting.
Thanks so much for listening to the Smart Community podcast. Show notes for this episode and all other episodes are available on our website, mysmart.community/podcast. If you have any questions for us or any of our guests, you can email hello@mysmart.community. You can also find us on the socials. We are on LinkedIn and Twitter @SmartComHQ. That's com with 2 M's. If you are enjoying the podcast, please hit subscribe so you never miss an episode. And we would love for you to leave us a rating and review at wherever you listen. This really helps us reach more ears and eyes, so thank you for your support. As always, we hope you enjoyed listening to this episode as much as we enjoyed making it.
The Smart Community Podcast is what you're looking for.